On a fall afternoon in Boston, Deborah Wilson gazed out the window of her small design office. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the air as people hurried along the street. Deborah worked at a small graphic design company while gradually establishing her own freelance business. She stared at the latest logo design on her computer screen, making slight adjustments. Though quiet and gentle by nature, Deborah was a perfectionist when it came to design. Tucking her long brown hair behind her ear, she let out a deep sigh. "Debbie, could you take a look at this?" her colleague Sarah called out. Debbie smiled and nodded, getting up to look at her colleague's design. She was always helpful, willing to put her own work aside to lend a hand when someone needed assistance. It was a kindness she'd inherited from her grandmother Eleanor. Eleanor, a woman Debbie deeply admired. Until her passing, Eleanor had been a respected figure in the community and Debbie's greatest supporter. A former banker with excellent financial sense, she had continued making wise investments after retirement. Though living frugally, she had accumulated substantial assets. "The most important thing in life isn't money, but your convictions," Eleanor often told Debbie. "Stand by your beliefs, no matter the circumstances." Debbie had taken these words to heart. On her way home after work, Debbie felt her phone ring. The screen displayed "Mom." She took a deep breath before answering. "Debbie, what are your plans for the weekend?" Martha's voice had its usual forceful tone. Debbie's mother Martha worked at a local real estate company. Flashy and pretentious, she had an abnormal obsession with keeping up appearances. "I have some work, but is there something going on?" Debbie answered cautiously. "Vicky is bringing her new boyfriend, and I'd like you to come for dinner. It's a good opportunity to show Wilson family unity." Victoria, Debbie's sister, scraped by with occasional modeling jobs but essentially lived off her mother's support. Like Martha, she was fixated on social reputation and material luxury. "All right, I'll be there," Debbie promised. She wanted to maintain a good relationship with her sister. That weekend, Debbie headed to Martha's house. As she stood at the entrance, the door opened to reveal Vicky's glamorous figure. "Debbie. It's been ages." Vicky exclaimed with exaggerated gestures. "Richard will be here soon. He's an investment banker." Debbie smiled and nodded. Entering the living room, she found Martha sitting on the sofa, drinking wine. "Finally, you're here," Martha said, eyeing Debbie's modest outfit with slight disapproval. "I thought you might dress up a bit more." Debbie quietly sat down, letting the conversation flow around her. During dinner, the topics centered mainly on Vicky's new boyfriend, Martha's social activities, and Wilson family dignity. Debbie quietly enjoyed her meal, occasionally nodding as she listened. "By the way, when are you planning to clean out Eleanor's house?" Martha suddenly asked. "I haven't decided yet," Debbie answered quietly. "I need a little more time." Martha sighed. "You shouldn't put it off forever. That house is too old, and Mother hoarded far too many things." "Grandma Eleanor was such a penny pincher," Vicky said mockingly. "She should have enjoyed life more." Debbie felt a tightness in her chest. Eleanor had indeed lived frugally, but it was a wise choice rooted in her dislike of waste. Besides, Eleanor had truly enjoyed life, not through material luxury, but through gaining knowledge, helping others, and spending time with family. "Grandma enjoyed life in her own chosen way," Debbie said quietly but firmly. "Yes, of course," Martha said lightly. "But she could have spent more money on herself. Especially her asset management methods were." Though suppressing her emotions, Debbie felt angry inside. At family gatherings, Martha and Vicky often made sarcastic remarks about Eleanor's asset management, which pained Debbie deeply. When Eleanor passed away, Debbie was overcome with profound grief. The funeral was modest, but many local residents and charity representatives attended, revealing how beloved Eleanor had been by so many. After the funeral, the family gathered to hear Eleanor's will read by her lawyer, Thomas Parker. Thomas greeted them warmly and took out the will. I will now read Mrs. Eleanor Wilson's last will and testament, Thomas said solemnly. Martha abruptly interrupted. Actually, Mother left almost nothing behind. Thomas looked slightly confused, but Martha continued. According to Mother's will, the estate consists only of a small amount of savings and a few pieces of old furniture, which are to be divided among the three of us. Debbie, overwhelmed with grief, simply nodded without pressing for details. The loss of Eleanor was so great that the matter of inheritance seemed secondary. What she truly cherished were the memories and teachings of her grandmother. It's really not much, Debbie said softly. Yes, Mother was frugal, but she spent almost everything on medical expenses in her later years, Martha explained. Though feeling doubtful, Debbie didn't pursue the matter further. She picked up a photograph of her grandmother and held it to her chest. Grandma, I won't forget your teachings, she silently vowed. For the next few weeks, Debbie spent her days working and grieving. She felt daily how significant Eleanor's presence had been in her life. 3 months after Eleanor's death, on a summer day in Boston, Debbie was swamped with work. A rebranding project for a major cosmetics company was nearing its critical phase, and she had been working almost non-stop. Looking at the mountain of papers scattered on her desk, she suddenly remembered. Those reference materials for the project, I think they're in Grandma's album. Eleanor had designed logos for local businesses in her youth. Debbie was proud of the talent she'd inherited from her grandmother and wanted to reference some of the old design materials. For that, she needed to visit her family home to check the old photo albums stored among her grandmother's belongings. That weekend, Debbie drove to her mother's suburban home. As she turned onto the familiar street in the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, an unfamiliar sight greeted her at her childhood home. New planters lined the entrance, the landscaping had been completely redone, and most eye-catching was a gleaming new luxury car in the driveway. Mom, did you buy a new car? Debbie asked in confusion as she got out of her car. Martha's usual vehicle was a practical sedan purchased 10 years ago. Parked before her was the latest model Cadillac. When she rang the doorbell, Martha greeted her in an elegant outfit. Debbie. It's been a while. How unusual for you to come without calling first. I'm sorry for dropping by suddenly. I came to borrow Grandma's photo albums, Debbie said as she entered the house. There, she encountered a sight she could hardly believe. In the entryway stood an elegant console table with an expensive vase displayed on top. Stepping into the living room, she saw the entire space had been transformed. Designer furniture, new carpeting, a large flat-screen TV, everything was luxurious and refined. Mom, did you redecorate the house? Debbie asked, unable to hide her surprise. Martha replied with a bright smile. It's been a dream of mine for years. At my age, I've finally gotten the space I truly want. Debbie looked out the window at the garden, where new garden tools and high-end patio furniture were visible. Is that car new too? Yes, it's a new Cadillac. It was delivered just yesterday before you came, Martha said proudly. I've always wanted one. Debbie was confused. Her mother's fashion brands seemed more expensive than ever, and her hairstyle was clearly done by a professional. She remembered how during the funeral 3 months ago, Martha had mentioned being financially strained. Where are Grandma's albums? Debbie changed the subject. I think I put them in the storage room upstairs. Go have a look yourself, Martha said with a wave of her hand. As Debbie started up the stairs, she heard the front door open. Vicky's voice rang out. Mom, I'm back. I ended up buying that necklace after all. Debbie stopped halfway up the stairs and looked down. Vicky's blonde hair was sleekly styled, and she wore a designer dress. On her left ring finger glittered a large diamond ring. Debbie. Vicky exclaimed when she noticed her sister. It's been ages. Debbie came down the stairs and greeted her sister. You look well, Vicky. Look, this is new. Vicky moved her finger to show off the ring. Isn't it lovely? It's beautiful, Debbie said quietly. But how could you afford something so expensive? Vicky smiled meaningfully and proudly answered, it's from Grandma's inheritance. When we divided it between the three of us, there was quite a bit left. Debbie was confused and disturbed. But Mom said there was hardly anything left. Did she say that? Vicky shrugged. Well, maybe she thought so at first, but there was actually plenty. Isn't Mom managing your share? Martha hurriedly entered the living room. What did you buy? Show me. Their conversation continued as if Debbie wasn't there. She felt anger rising inside her, but she strived to maintain her composure. I'll go upstairs and look for the album, she said, noticing that no one was paying attention to her. Upstairs, she entered the storage room where Eleanor's belongings were haphazardly piled. As Debbie began searching for the album, her mother and sister's words kept echoing in her mind. When we divided it between the three of us, there was quite a bit left. Isn't Mom managing your share? She finally found the old leather-bound album and took it out. On her way out of the storage room, she noticed that the door to Martha's study was open. Peering inside, she saw new antique-style office furniture and Eleanor's cherished paintings hanging on the walls. Debbie quietly entered the room and picked up a small framed photograph of her grandmother. Grandma, what's going on? She whispered. Just then, Martha entered the room. Oh, here you are. Did you find the album? Debbie calmly asked, tell me the truth. How much was the inheritance? And what about my share? Martha's expression froze momentarily. She entered the room and closed the door. You always worry about such trivial matters, she said in a lowered voice. There was hardly anything, really. Your share went toward paying off debts that Vicky and I were burdened with. That's fine, isn't it? You earn enough in Boston. Debbie was speechless. It became clear that the inheritance her grandmother had left her had not been given to her at all. Moreover, Martha and Vicky had started living luxuriously using the inheritance. Though she felt a sense of betrayal and anger constricting her chest, Debbie didn't show her emotions. I see, Debbie said quietly. I'll borrow the album. Martha looked relieved and said, of course. But take good care of it. It's a memento of Eleanor. Debbie said nothing and quietly went downstairs. Vicky was absorbed in her smartphone on the sofa and didn't notice Debbie. I'm leaving, Debbie announced briefly. Already? Martha exclaimed with theatrical surprise. Won't you stay for tea at least? I'm busy today. I'll take the album home. I'll be in touch. Debbie got into her car. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, she held back tears. Grandma, what should I do? She whispered as she started the engine. The album she had placed on the back seat caught the corner of her eye. Debbie drove away from Martha's house and parked her car at a seaside park. Listening to the quiet sound of waves, she opened the album. With each turn of the page, memories of Eleanor came flooding back. She noticed an envelope inserted into the last page, and upon opening it, found Thomas Parker's business card with a note in Eleanor's handwriting, contact when the time comes. Debbie stared at the card for a long time. In her mind, she heard Eleanor's voice, stand by your beliefs, no matter the circumstances. Debbie took a deep breath and put the card in her pocket. For several days, Debbie agonized over what to do. Contacting the lawyer could essentially be the first step toward taking legal action against her own family. However, to respect her grandmother Eleanor's teachings and wishes, she needed to uncover the truth. Grandma, what would you do? Debbie whispered, gazing out the window. She already knew the answer. Eleanor had always valued truth and justice. Debbie made her decision and called Thomas Parker's law office. Parker Law Office, a receptionist answered. Hello, this is Deborah Wilson. I'd like to meet with Mr. Thomas Parker. Ms. Wilson. The receptionist's voice changed slightly. Please hold. After a brief pause, a man's voice came on the line. Deborah Wilson? This is Thomas Parker. I've been expecting your call. Debbie was surprised. You were expecting? Yes. Could you come to my office tomorrow at 2 p.m.? There's something we need to discuss regarding Eleanor. The next day, Debbie visited the Parker Law Office located in a historic building in Boston's financial district. Opening the heavy wooden door, she entered a waiting room furnished with classical furnishings. Ms. Wilson, we've been expecting you, the receptionist guided her. Thomas Parker was a man with a gentle expression. He immediately stood up when he saw Debbie and offered his hand. It's an honor to meet you, Thomas greeted her with a warm smile. Eleanor anticipated your visit. Debbie was surprised. Grandma did. Thomas nodded and said, Eleanor was a very wise woman. She understood her family's nature well, as he moved toward the safe behind his desk. He entered the combination and took out an envelope. This was entrusted to me by Eleanor, with instructions to open it 6 months after the reading of the will, or when you came to see me. He motioned for Debbie to move to the conference table in the center of the office. As Thomas opened the envelope, legal documents and a handwritten letter emerged. Thomas reviewed the documents and said quietly, This is a dual will. Separate from the officially registered one, Eleanor entrusted me with her true will. Debbie was confused. A dual will. Why would she do that? Thomas answered with a sad expression, Eleanor was concerned that Martha and Victoria might monopolize the inheritance. In the first will, she recorded only minimal assets and instructed them to be divided equally. However, Eleanor's actual assets far exceeded that. Thomas looked up from the documents. Eleanor's true estate included multiple real estate investments, a stock portfolio, and substantial cash deposits. According to this original will, all of it was to be divided equally into 3 parts. Debbie was speechless. She looked at the letter on the table. Thomas noticed and said, This is a letter from Eleanor addressed to you, as he handed it to her. With trembling hands, Debbie opened the envelope. Dear Debbie, if you are reading this letter, then as I predicted, Martha and Vicky have not told the truth about my will. I have long worried about their spending habits and vanity. I chose this method to prevent them from using my assets unfairly. Thomas has been given all financial records and a true inventory of the estate. Legal procedures are also in place to ensure you are treated fairly. You have always been my pride. Your honesty and integrity are my greatest joy. This is not merely a matter of property, but a matter of justice. I trust your judgment. With love, Grandma. Debbie, though tearful, was resolute. Eleanor had trusted and guided her until the end. Thomas gave her time and waited quietly. Mr. Parker, Debbie finally spoke. What options do I have in this matter? Thomas gently said, As per Eleanor's instructions, preparations for legal action are in place. It's up to you. Debbie took a deep breath and answered, Please proceed with a formal investigation. I want the truth to be revealed. Thomas nodded and said, Let's start with an asset evaluation and an investigation of transactions that have already taken place. Preliminary findings show that Martha moved approximately $450,000 to a separate account immediately after the will's execution. Debbie was shocked. That much? Thomas calmly continued, Eleanor's true assets amount to approximately $1.5 million. Your rightful share should have been about $500,000. Debbie said quietly, This isn't about the money. This is about trust and justice. I want to do what Grandma wished. I understand, Thomas nodded. We'll prepare a legal notice to send to Martha and Victoria. Without a court order, it may be difficult to recover funds that have already been spent, but we can assert your rights to the remaining assets. Debbie thought quietly. Before sending the notice, I'd like to speak with them directly. They're family. I want to give them a chance to talk. Thomas showed understanding. That's also an option. However, we should secure the evidence. I'll give you a list of assets identified in our investigation and a copy of the original will. If the issue remains unresolved, we'll proceed with legal action. Debbie nodded at Thomas's words and put the documents in her bag. As she left the office, she turned back and said, "Thank you, Mr. Parker. Grandma had a good friend." Thomas smiled. "Eleanor was a friend I respected. It's an honor to help uphold her beliefs." Debbie left the office building and walked in the light of the autumn afternoon. Her heart was filled with complex emotions, but one thing was clear. She would stand up to preserve her grandmother's wishes and see justice done. "Grandma, I'll honor your teachings." As the investigation progressed, events began to move rapidly. Thomas's office analyzed Eleanor's financial records in detail, gathering evidence of Martha and Vicky's misuse of the inheritance. Thursday evening, Thomas called Debbie. "Ms. Wilson, we have the evidence ready. We're prepared to submit it to court. All that remains is to send a formal notice to Martha and Victoria." Debbie took a deep breath as she gazed at the Boston evening skyline outside her window. "I understand. But I want to speak with them directly first." She emailed her mother saying she would visit over the weekend. The reply came immediately, "Of course, come anytime. Vicky will be here too." Saturday afternoon, Debbie visited her family home again. This time it wasn't just a visit, but a quest for truth. She rang the doorbell and waited. Behind the door Martha opened, Debbie could see the increasingly luxurious interior of the house. Martha herself was dressed in expensive clothes and wearing new jewelry. "It's been a while. Come in." In the living room, Vicky sat operating the latest tablet. She too was wearing high-end branded clothing, with a new bracelet gleaming on her wrist. "Debbie. Can I get you something to drink?" Vicky stood up with a smile. "No, thank you," Debbie said as she took documents from her bag. "Would you both please sit down?" Martha and Vicky exchanged subtle glances and sat on the sofa. Debbie sat in the chair opposite them and, looking straight into their eyes, said, "I have something to ask you both. Please tell me the truth about Grandma's inheritance." Martha's expression hardened. "I told you before. It wasn't much. But all these new furnishings, the new car, Vicky's diamond, where did they all come from?" Debbie asked calmly but firmly. Vicky shifted uncomfortably. "That's our savings. We've been holding back for years." Debbie slowly shook her head. "I'm sorry, but that's not the truth," she said, taking out documents from her bag. "I've spoken with attorney Thomas Parker. I know about Grandma's true will." The color drained from Martha's face. What are you talking about?" Debbie produced a copy of her grandmother's letter and the asset inventory prepared by Thomas. "Grandma anticipated that you would hide the truth. She left a dual will." Martha suddenly stood up and said in a voice trembling with anger, "That's nonsense. No such will exists." "Unfortunately, it does," Debbie replied calmly. "As well as records of all the money improperly used from the estate. Thomas's office is prepared to take legal action." Vicky's face changed, and she asked in a small voice, "Legal action?" "Yes. On suspicion of fraud and embezzlement," Debbie said quietly. "But that's not what I want. What I want is truth and fairness." Vicky began to cry. "What are you going to do?" Martha paced the room, agitated. "Debbie, are you really going to do this? Take your own family to court? What about the Wilson family honor?" Debbie took a deep breath. "I don't want this to go to court. What I want is fairness. To divide the inheritance equally, as Grandma wished." Martha and Vicky fell silent. Silence filled the room, with only the sound of autumn wind rattling the windows from outside. "I have a suggestion on how to proceed," Debbie continued. First, acknowledge the truth. Then, create a plan to return my share. That way, we won't need to proceed with legal action. After a tense silence, Martha sat down, looking tired. All right. She finally admitted. Eleanor's estate was more than we expected. We were blinded by greed. Vicky also tearfully acknowledged, we thought Debbie could always manage on her own, that she didn't need it. Debbie said quietly, that wasn't for you to decide. You should have respected Grandma's wishes. Martha bowed her head. You're right. We were wrong. So, what do we do now? Vicky asked anxiously. Debbie spread out the documents. My rightful share is about $500,000. You've probably already spent some of it, so let's create a repayment plan. Thomas has prepared a settlement agreement. The three spent the afternoon discussing details. Martha agreed to sell the new car, and Vicky agreed to part with some of her luxury jewelry. They also agreed to make up the difference from the proceeds of selling Eleanor's real estate. Eventually, the three reached an agreement. Martha and Vicky agreed to return Debbie's rightful share and to repay what they had spent through future plans. Thomas prepared a legal settlement document, which all three signed. At dusk, as Debbie was about to leave, Martha accompanied her to the door. The two were silent for a long time, but finally Martha took Debbie's hand. I'm sorry, Debbie. We were wrong, her voice was filled with sincerity. Eleanor was so proud of you, and she was right. You're like her. Debbie looked at her mother. The anger had not completely disappeared, but there was also a desire to understand. From now on, let's live honestly and respect Grandma's memory, she said. On her way home, Debbie parked her car by the sea and watched the sunset. Complex emotions swirled within her, but one thing was certain. She had upheld her grandmother's teachings. She had stood up for justice and stayed true to her convictions. Grandma, did I do the right thing? She quietly asked the sky. A ray of light shone on her face from between the sunset-colored clouds. Debbie saw it and smiled. The answer was already in her heart. She started her car and drove off toward her new life. 1 year later, a sign for Elegant Design Works gleamed on the third floor of a brick building in Boston. Debbie had opened her own design studio with the funds inherited from Eleanor. The store name came from her grandmother's initials, EDW. Eleanor's photograph hung on the office wall, her warm smile watching over Debbie every day. The business was growing steadily, and she had hired 2 young local designers, mentoring them just as her grandmother had done for her. Debbie, a new client is here, her assistant Kate called. Thank you, Debbie smiled and stood up. Her expression showed a confidence and composure she had never had before. Meanwhile, Martha and Vicky's lives had changed significantly. The luxury car was sold, and most of the expensive furniture was disposed of. Considering her age, Martha took early retirement and opened a small flower shop. This was something she had secretly dreamed of for years. Happy birthday, Mrs. Johnson, Martha said with a smile as she handed over a bouquet. Her expression was softer and more serene than before. By letting go of pretense and vanity and living as her true self, she had found a new sense of fulfillment. Vicky showed the most surprising change. She began studying accounting seriously, particularly developing an interest in managing elderly people's assets. I learned from the experience with Grandma, she told Debbie. I want to prevent elderly people from being deceived or having their property unfairly handled. While attending community college, Vicky also began volunteering at a senior center. No longer wearing flashy jewelry, she bustled about in simple, practical clothing. The last Sunday of each month became a tradition for the 3 women to have dinner together. Though awkward at first, conversations flowed naturally as time passed. Debbie, that recent ad campaign was wonderful, Martha genuinely rejoiced in her daughter's success. Thank you, Mom. The new logo for your flower shop is popular too, Debbie replied. Vicky, helping herself to salad, said, "Next week, I'm starting a financial management course for seniors. I'm nervous, but I'll do my best." On the second anniversary of Eleanor's death, the three women visited Eleanor's grave. Each placed a white rose and quietly conveyed their gratitude. "Grandma would be happy to see this sight," Vicky said quietly. "Yes, she certainly would," Debbie smiled. "Grandma's greatest wish was for us to find our own paths and live honestly." Martha nodded silently and placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Eleanor gave each of us a gift. For me, true fulfillment, for Vicky, purpose, and for Debbie, courage. And above all, an opportunity for us to reunite as a family," Debbie added. The three figures leaving the cemetery represented a family that had overcome past mistakes and formed new bonds. Eleanor's true legacy lived on in their hearts.